sorry for stopping so fast in the first video, but it's not allowed to upload video responses to YouTube which are longer than 10 minutes, so I had to make a shorter comment. I'm sorry for that. So where do we stop? We stopped at the Gnostic Gospels and the Gnostic recordings of Jesus. Like I told you, these books are usually dated really late. So when you criticize the New Testament books for being written 40 years later than 30 AD, you should really don't go to these books to ask for historical reliability on the life of Jesus. A lot of these contents, they don't even want to make a portrait of Jesus as he was. They want to put Jesus into their Gnostic philosophy, which is not part of Jesus' teaching at all, how we find it as we find it in the Gospel of, in the canonical Gospels in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So this political tendency of Nicaea might have been there, but Nicaea was not the decision of the canon. The process of canonization was longer and more complicated, much more complicated. So I made some notes about what you were saying and what I want to say. So this is because this is where I look down sometime. So you were also talking about the pagan influence on Christianity. Actually, you're talking about that a lot. I also watched some other videos where you say this a lot. And the problem about this is that you don't give any example of any pagan story. At least I didn't see it, but in this video you didn't give it, and the other videos I saw you didn't give it either. So when you're claiming that there's pagan influence on the Old and New Testament, give me some examples. Let me give you an example for you. It was a long believed thought that the stories of the dying and rising gods in the ancient area of Egypt and also the Greek parts of the Middle East are kind of a motive for the resurrection of Jesus, so that the Christian authors just copied that. There are two basic problems with this view. Actually, I don't even know of any other serious discussion of pagan parallels to the Gospels. But this one I know, and this is why I want to challenge it. So there are two serious problems with this view. The first one is that we don't know of any influence of any of these pagan cults to Palestine in the first century, especially Galilee. There is no written document which proves that any of these pagan cults had any influence on the people in Palestine in the first century. But we know that the Gospels were written by people from Palestine in the first century. So how do we explain that? The second part is that the theological aim of these mythology stories in Egypt or the Greek mythology is totally different from the theological aim we have in the stories of the resurrection of Jesus. The stories in Egypt, for example, they stick around the circle of putting seeds on the field and harvest. Actually, we see this a lot in the whole of the ancient Near East. It's also reflected in the Bible, for example, that we have a lot of mythology around this circle of putting seeds on the field and harvesting them again. So as you might know, the Nile is carrying a lot of water in some time of the year, so it is possible to even grow, for example, grain in Egypt. And this is really at the center of Egyptian culture, that the Nile carries a lot of water at some time, and that this allows them to grow wheat, for example. And this is also what they put their mythology around. So it's kind of that their religion is based on the phenomenons they see in nature. And This is why these dying and rising gods from Egypt, for example, they die and rise every year. It's not like that they die and then they stay in death for like 3 days and then they rise again in physical bodies. No, this is more of a spiritual thing. There is no rising in physical bodies. This is more of a rebirth. And second thing is, no one of these Egyptian worshippers would have even spent a thought on a physical man dying and rising again. This is just not part of their mythology. So even if we have the same vocabulary in the resurrection accounts of Jesus and the mythology of ancient Greek or ancient Egypt, there is no hint that they depend on each other. Not at all. So if you talk about pagan influence on the Bible, please give examples. Otherwise, nobody can prove it. Second thing is, no, not second thing, I was saying second thing, I'm sorry. Next thing is, you're talking about the Old Testament, and there is no, or really not a lot of archaeological evidence for the Old Testament. I can live with that. I'm totally fine with that. I know that there is not a lot of archaeological evidence, but we have to ask the question, why? Why is there not a lot of archaeological evidence? For example, you're talking about the Exodus. So what might we expect to find about the Exodus? Sure, we might expect to find some archaeological hint for a big people group wandering around in the desert. But for example, the big wandering of the Amorites, we don't find anything about it archaeologically. We know that they wandered because of the difference they made in the culture where they came to. So we discovered that there was an Amorite language spoken in Mesopotamia from the 2nd century on. So we know that they wandered and they came to Mesopotamia, but we don't find any archaeological evidence of their wandering itself. Same thing with the big walking of the Semites in the 2nd century from the eastern part of Mesopotamia to the western part. This is also the wandering where Abraham took part in. So, what might we search for? We might search for written documents talking about Hebrew slaves in Egypt. We might search for evidence in Canaan that there was a new people group like the Hebrews coming into Canaan. So I would think there we have some hints of Israel being in Egypt. For example, we have some documents in Egypt speaking about Semitic slaves. It's not sure that these were the Hebrews. Maybe they were Hebrews and other Semitic slaves, but at least we know for sure that there were Semitic slaves in Egypt. Maybe you could ask, why do we have that less evidence for Semitic slaves in Egypt? The thing is, the place where they lived and worked, it's mentioned in the Bible, the land of Goshen, is really close to the Nile, and there's a lot of humid. And as you know, Egyptians were writing on papyrus. And papyrus won't last in that kind of climate. It just perishes. And this is not, I don't, as I read that first, I found this to be a really silly argument until I knew where it comes from. It comes from Kenneth Kitchen. He's professor for ancient Egypt in the University of Cambridge. And he's the most specialized scholar on the Second Intermediate Period, which is especially the period where Israel was in Egypt. And he says that it's highly probable that Israel was in Egypt. And he also says that we don't find any scriptural evidence for that because of the perishing of the papyri in the land of Goshen. You might read this book. It's called On the Reliability of the Old Testament, I think. And I might stop here and go for the third part.